We are in the part 6 of the series on 1 and 2 Thessalonians. Till now, we have looked into the historical background of forming of the church at Thessalonica. And we saw that they became a model church primarily because of faith, hope, and love. Right? Specifically, the hope that Anna highlighted today about the fact that we will all meet up in heaven and Jesus Christ will come again. That's a promise that He has made, and He is a promise keeper. Right? We saw that, so because of that, we saw that the Thessalonian church gives us a number of lessons that we can learn, especially for a small church, about how do we build a true church. And we saw several aspects of that. We have seen three pillars that make the true church. And today, we've seen the three pillars like true transformation, true ministry, and true fellowship. Right? And today, we are going to see to true evangelism. But before we go there, yesterday, last Sunday, when we talked about true fellowship, one of the things that we learned about is to encourage the people who work in the background and normally don't get encouraged, right? So, shall we all give John a big hand for organizing the Women's Day celebration? Thank you, John. Thank you for doing all that and in the background and getting things ready. Now, true evangelism. I think again, Anna laid out a very beautifully. She laid out the reasons why we should focus on true evangelism. Right? Why should we be bothered about evangelism? Why should we be bothered about spreading the word? Right? Why should we be? Because as the songwriter said, Anna's last song, right? As songwriter says, when we get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing it will be. But as Anna said, that word when is applicable for us, for people who believe in Jesus, for people who have accepted the Lord. But there's a whole lot of people outside where that word when is not true. For them, the songwriter should put it as if. Right? Now, how do we convert that if to when? Is when we can help them through, sharing the good news with them. That's one of our response. That is the Great Commission. That's what Christian life is all about. Paul's letters establish that Thessalonian church did that, isn't it? Paul's letters establish the fact that Thessalonian church became a center of evangelism. They found ways to make sure that surrounding areas heard about Jesus, heard about His saving grace, heard about the hope that they have, right? And the entire area heard about what happened to the Thessalonians because of Jesus Christ. Paul confirms that in 1 Thessalonians 1:8. So that's where we will start. 1 Thessalonians 1:8. Open your Bibles and one of you can read it out, please. 1 Thessalonians 1:8. From you, the word of the Lord has sounded forth, not just in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place. Imagine the impact, imagine the spread of a small church. Your faith toward God has gone out, and so we don't need to say anything about you. Your faith about God has gone out, right? So I was thinking about it. And as I prepared to study with you and examine with you this particular aspect, one question came to my mind: how did Thessalonian church become a center of evangelism? How did they become a center of evangelism? Right? At that time when Thessalonian church was in place, there were no seminaries, right? We were dishing out DMins and PhDs and degrees, postgraduates in missions and evangelism. There were no missions conferences being held, right? There were no mission associations that developed strategies for evangelizing and all that stuff. So none of those were available. So how did they become the center of evangelism? How did the word of the Lord sound forth from them, not just in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place, right? So that's really what I thought we will we can look at. There's no books on these written at that time, right, on how to evangelize, right? And so there's no evangelistic retreats that we can look at. So how did they learn to evangelize? How did they learn to evangelize? And I think the answer all of us know. The answer is that they had something greater than all of this. They had Paul to look up. They had the example of Paul to look up. So when we look at evangelization, we are going to look at how did Paul evangelize the Thessalonian crowd. How did we set up? So that's really what we are going to this thing, right? So how the Thessalonians came to accept the word of God is what we will be looking at, right? And then we know that it happened, and we know that it not only resulted in the formation of the church, but the true transformation, as we looked at in part 3 of this series, right? True transformation. Right? So the study of these episodes reveals several aspects around 2 focus areas, right? For a mission, for an evangelism, you got to have 2 things. One is the mission field, right? The field should be there, and the methods of evangelism, right? So we're going to look at what can we learn from Paul's life and Paul's ministry at Thessalonica and Paul's letter to Thessalonians about these 2 things: the mission field itself and the methods of evangelism that Paul used, and see which of them is applicable to us as the Lord calls us to, go and share the good news with others, so that that word, when we all get to heaven, is applicable not just for us, but for the Hindus around us, the Muslims around us, and the Sikhs around us, and others, right? It becomes for everyone, not just for the people who are in the church. So let's look at the mission field. Let's look at the mission. Now, again, in part 1, when we looked at the demographics, I don't know if any of you remember that, the demographics of the region when Paul landed in Thessalonica, right? Obviously it was a place of commerce, it was a place of, importance and stuff like that. But from the book of Acts, we can actually surmise that the population of Thessalonica was a mix of several religious and racial ethnicities, right? There were of course Jews settled there. There were Greeks, and there were many other people with different religious this thing. Now, unconfirmed sources, I can't say that this is absolutely true, but unconfirmed sources say that the Jews were anywhere between 10 to 25% of the Thessalonian population at that time. Right? The Jews were in that this thing. So it's safe to assume that majority of the people were what we call as Greco-Roman, right? Greeks or Romans, or a combination of them, the amalgamation of Greeks and Romans, Greco-Roman. So what characterizes the Greco-Roman culture? Polytheism. They worship several gods, right? Idol worship. They have a lot of idols set up all over the places. Paul referred to as in heathens, right? And then immorality, right? They were worshipping Aphrodite, right? So temple prostitution and stuff like that was a common thing in that place. So immorality, injustice, social, injustice and stuff like that were prevalent in that culture. And those are the things that characterized a typical Greco-Roman culture in those times, right? And we also discussed the geographical positioning of Thessalonica, right? We saw that it was almost on the foothills of Mount Olympus, and Mount Olympus is the abode of the Greek gods, right? At least 12 of them, right? And so that obviously had an impact on the religious practices of the place, right? So it is into this culture that Paul walks in to evangelize, right? He's not walking into somewhere where the message is already reached or accepted or whatever it is. It is in a culture where there is a lot of polytheism, idol worship, immorality, injustice, and stuff like that. The Greco-Roman culture that Paul bravely walks in. And the beauty of that is he walks into this place not from a place of great success. It's not that he was a successful missionary in another place and then he comes here. Where does he walk into Thessalonica from? From Philippi. He reaches Thessalonica from Philippi. And what happened to him in Philippi? He was charged, he was put into jail, and through a miraculous, he had a miraculous escape, and then, so he was persecuted in Philippi. And then he walks into a similar place, right? He talks into a similar place. 1 Thessalonians 2:2 says, but even after we had suffered before and were spitefully treated at Philippi. Just imagine that. Paul is explaining where he is coming from. He says, this is in 1 Thessalonians 2:2. But even after we had suffered before and were spitefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we were bold in our God to speak to you the gospel of God in much conflict. So it is not as if Paul expected anything different. Paul knew that it's going to be different. Paul knew that it is going to be difficult. It's going to be a difficult mission field. And Paul knew that he was going to be persecuted, and all that comes into act, right? And if you switch back to Acts 17, 5 to 9, right? If we can refer to Acts 17, 5 to 9, what's described there in Acts 17, 5 to 9, you see how hostile the Jews were to the word, to what Paul was doing, to the extent that they went and attacked Jason's house where Paul was staying, right? So Paul was staying in Jason's house, and they go and attack Jason, drag him out, and then force him to throw them down. So the hostility of the Jews is very evident in that passage. The beauty is the hostility did not stop just there. So Paul was thrown out of Thessalonica because the Jews were hostile. And Paul went to Berea. And Paul started a church there. Wherever Paul goes, he has to preach the gospel, right? He can't do anything else other than preach the gospel. So he preached the gospel in Berea. And the Jews in Thessalonica heard that, that Paul is doing the same thing in Berea. And they went all the way from Thessalonica to Berea to stop Paul from doing it. Can you believe that? Acts 17:13. Acts 17:13 says, but when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was preached by Paul at Berea, they came there also and stirred up the crowds. Right? So imagine the hostility, right? They not only that you were driven from my place, but hey, you can't preach the gospel anywhere. Right? Wherever you go, if you're preaching the gospel, we will come and trouble you. That's the type of mentality that's the amount of hostility that the Jews held for Paul. Right? It didn't stop just at Thessalonica. It's sort of pursuit of Paul wherever he goes. Imagine going from Thessalonica all the way to Berea to stop Paul from preaching there, right? And that's the level of level of hostility that the Jews at Thessalonica had. Now, in contrast to that, right? So we see that the Jews in Thessalonica were very hostile. In contrast to that, let us look at the Jews in Berea, right? What does Acts 17:11 to 12 say? Acts 17:11 to 12. So you see that the Thessalonican Jews were very hostile to Paul, but the Jews in Berea were not that hostile. They were actually more receiving. They were more welcoming. It says that they were more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica, and were willing to at least examine it with him. And then he goes on to say that Acts 17:12 says, therefore many of them believed, and also not a few of the Greeks and prominent women among them as well. This is the Berean church. This is not the Thessalonican church. Acts 17:11 to 12 is talking about Berea, right? So the church in Berea was formed, in favorable conditions. The only opposition that came was from the Jews who came all the way from Thessalonica to give trouble, but the Bereans themselves were very, very receiving of the word. So you see the formation of the Berean church was a lot more easier than forming the Thessalonian church. Right? We see the contrast. Right now, I want you to compare Acts 17:12, which you just now read, to Acts 17:4. Okay, so just compare. I actually, it's like I could actually put those verses together and ask you to spot the difference. You played the game of spotting the difference, right? So if you look at 17:4 and then 17:12, you will see that they are more or less identical, isn't it? It talks about who came into faith because of Paul's this thing, and it actually is Jews, Greeks, and women. Right? It talks about both in Berea as well as in Thessalonica. The church is formed by this group of Jews, Greeks, and women. Right? But there is one key difference. Paul uses the term, when referring to Berea, Paul uses the term many. He uses many Greeks, but when he uses the term, when he goes to 17:4, where he's talking about Thessalonica, he uses the term multitude. See the difference, right? So, I mean, just look at it. Berea was a favorable mission field, and Luke says many people came to know the Lord. Thessalonica was a difficult mission field, and Luke says multitude of people came to know the Lord. You see the difference? Right? See the difference? Which was a difficult mission field? Thessalonica. Which was an easier Berea. And then go on to look at, that I of course, I absolutely mean no disrespect to the Berean believers, right? I'm sure they did great job. They believed the Lord, and they formed the church and things like that. But it is a fact that when Paul identifies a church from where the word of the God sounded forth, he does not pick Berea. Which one does he pick? Thessalonica, Thessalonian church. And what's the difference between the Berean church and Thessalonian church? Thessalonian church was formed under persecution, under suffering, with a lot of resistance. Berean church was a lot more easier to form, right? So, I think right there is the first mark of true evangelism that we can remember. And it is this: true evangelism is not done in places which are comfortable. True evangelism is not done without resistance. True evangelism is not where you evangelize a very favorable crowd. True evangelism is when you communicate the gospel in the face of oppression, in the face of threats, in the face of persecution. Right? In part 4 of the series, I gave this analogy of the resistance bands that we use, and also I use the analogy of Harley Davidson, because I love Harley Davidson bikes, right? And the message there was very simple: resistance builds strength. Resistance builds strength, right? And that is really what So I think this is a challenge and a comfort to the evangelists in our country, and this should be a challenge to all of us too. There is persecution, there is threat, there is problem, there is fear outside, that if we share the gospel, what can happen to us. But remember, Paul did that, and that is where true evangelism happened, right? Acts 17:4, we go back to Acts 17:4, he uses an adjective for the Greeks. What is the adjective that he uses for the Greeks? God-fearing. In NKJV, it uses devout, right? So God-fearing or devout. Now, you look at people around us. Aren't they God-fearing? Aren't they devout? Now, who they are devout to and which God they are fearing is a different aspect. But they are God-fearing people around us. They are devout people around us, isn't it? All of us. I mean, this is a very religious country, right? So everyone is devout, right? You look at the queues in the temple. I mean, yesterday, right? Yesterday or was it Friday? Yeah, Friday was Mahashivratri. You look at the queues in the temples, you would know we are a nation of devout people. Right? Look at the Ram temple inauguration ceremony. How many people have gone, and they are still going? There are special trains being run. We are a country. We are a nation of devout people. And Paul says that those devout people turned and threw away their idols and turned to serve the true God because of the gospel. True evangelism is when such devout people are transformed and they are willing to throw away their idols and worship the true God. And there's a role for us in that, right? there's a role for us. And that's what happened in Thessalonica. 1 Thessalonians 1:9 says this, that the Thessalonians turned to God from idols. 1 Thessalonians 1:9. He says they turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God. Paul evangelized a city that was hostile. Paul evangelized a city that consisted of people known for their devotion to their gods, small g. Paul evangelized people who were idol worshippers. And Paul did this amidst oppression and persecution and threats. So I'm convinced that if it can happen in Thessalonica, it can happen in India. If it can happen in Thessalonica, it can happen in our nation. So let's hold on to that hope and cling on to that promise that Jesus said, I will build my church. I will build my church. And obviously continue to, support and pray for the evangelists who are doing the work. Plus, see what I can do. I can do to share the good news with people around us. So that's the mission field, right? The field was not a conducive one, not a receptive one. It was a hostile one, and there were persecution and oppression and things like that, idol worshippers, and Paul evangelized in that particular mission field. Now let's look at some of the methods of true evangelism, right? After looking at the mission field, let's shift our focus to the methods of true evangelism. The first one that came to my mind when we read the book of the Acts and Thessalonians is the cultural alignment that we need to bring in, right? Acts 17, 1-2. If we go back to Acts 17, 1-2, it says that it was Paul's custom, wherever he went, to start his evangelistic activities from a synagogue. So it says that as was his custom, he went into a synagogue and started preaching. So it was his usual custom to go into a synagogue. Now, why do you think he starts his evangelistic efforts in a synagogue? Exactly. Thank you. Yes. He is a Jew. He is a Jew. He knows the Jewish customs. He knows the Jewish history. He knows the Torah. Right? And so it is easier for him to align, and people will recognize him. People will know that he is one among them. And then so the receptivity will be a lot more. Right? So starting at the synagogue gave him that head start. Right? Paul's evangelistic, Paul's setting up of churches is not a 5-year plan. Right? Thessalonica, he set up the church in how many days? In 3 weeks. Right? So he doesn't have the 5-year plan for every church. So he has to do things fast, and so he looks for a good head start. And this is what the synagogues give him, where he's accepted culturally, and then he can reach them, and through them reach the others and things like that. But Paul, it's not just in synagogues. Paul actually emphasizes this adaptation into the culture very clearly in 1 Corinthians 9, 19-23. 1 Corinthians 9, 19-23. Can one of us read that, please? 1 Corinthians 9, 19-23. What's he saying? That phrase summarizes it all. I became all things to all men so that I might, save some. Right? So he says, I am, so wherever I go, I adapt to that culture. I become who they are so that they are willing to receive me. They don't see me as a foreigner. They don't see me as an alien. They don't see me as an external person. They see me as an insider. They see me as one from that path. Right? And so he says, that's what I am. All things to all men, so that all may be saved. To the Jews, he became a Jew. To the Gentiles, he became a Gentile. And to the weak, he became a weak, etc., 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 etc. That's the level of cultural integration that marks true evangelism. Actually, we can see this in the lives of the missionaries. If you study the lives of missionaries, take some of the well-known missionaries: William Carey, Amy Carmichael, right? David Livingstone, Hudson Taylor. We all know that. India, China, right? Africa. Wherever they went, they spent several years integrating themselves into the culture. Take Amy Carmichael for instance. She came here and she studied the Tamil culture, Tamil language, and stuff like that. She wore Indian clothes, just like much time Anna does for us, right? So she wore Indian culture. She lived with local people. She didn't look for a expat colony to live in, right? She lived among the local people. She spoke the she studied the local language, the local culture, and then he set up the Donovo Fellowship. Right? And you will see the same similarities in William Carey. It took several years to learn Bengali and understand this thing. Of course, David Livingstone's story is very well documented. Hudson Taylor did the same thing in China, right? So basically, we will see the one thing common with all these great missionaries is they took time to integrate themselves into the culture. So I think one of the things that we need to understand is that look, we cannot go approach them from a point of superiority. We've got to be one among them before we can, really preach the gospel or share the gospel with them. Cultural alignment is essential for true evangelism. The second thing Paul does is what I call as customized communication. Right? It's my term. It's not Paul's term, but I would like to call it as customized communication. Right? Now, what he does is beautiful. What he does is he communicates the gospel to the audience through a contextually relevant means, whatever is the means. Right? For example, he knows that Jews are, where there is, there are a lot of people who are logical, isn't it? The personality types and stuff like that, right? How many of you are logical people from the personality types who like logic, the right, wrong, and stuff like that, right? So for logical people, what you need is reasoning. You got to be able to reason with them, right? They don't go by feeling. They don't go by feeling. They got to know that is, what is the appropriate thing, and so I'm one of them, right? So for and Paul says he used that in Acts 17, 2-3. He says Paul reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus whom I preached to you is the Christ." So he's basically building upon what they already know. The Messiah is coming and all that, and then reasoning with them, right? Appealing to their logic. So there will always be people who need logical reasons to believe, and we need to be able to. So we have to understand the audience, right? You can't say that, look, this is the way I speak, and so this is what I'm going to stick to. It is something that in corporates we call it, especially in workshop facilitation and all that, we call it as learner-centered facilitation, right? It's not about me who is preaching the gospel. It's not about me who is facilitating. It's about what they can learn. And for that, we got to be able to speak to what they need. If they need logic, we got to be able to provide logic. The second customization that we can see in Paul's approach is hope, right? 1 Thessalonians 1:5. 1 Thessalonians 1:5. The gospel did not come to you just in word, but it came in power and in Holy Spirit and with much assurance. That's what New King James Version puts it. So he provided hope and assurance where it is required. The gospel comes to you with the assurance. What is the assurance? Assurance of the salvation, assurance of the second coming, assurance that we will all be in heaven one day, right? If we believe in Jesus Christ. And the assurance that he gives in 1 Thessalonians 5:9-10. That's a beautiful assurance. He says, 1 Thessalonians, he says, "For God did not appoint us to wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, that whether we wake or sleep, we should live together with him." That's the promise. That's the hope that he is giving. Right? So he is speaking the language of hope to the people who are hopeless. Right? He is speaking the language of hope to those who are hopeless. Thirdly, Paul speaks the language. Paul actually uses, when he communicates gospel, he communicates with love and care. Right? 1 Thessalonians 2:7-8. 1 Thessalonians 2:7-8. Just imagine this. We were gentle with you as a nursing mother. Just imagine that. I mean, can you have an imaginary greater than that to convey the affection that one can have, the nursing mother? And then he goes on to say that we affectionately longing for you. We again, we were pleased not to impart to you not only the gospel, but our own lives. We poured our lives into you. Just like a nursing mother pours her life into the child, Paul says, we poured our life into you. That's the way we have loved you. That's the way we have cared. Right? So Paul says that look, we are not just preaching the gospel to you. We are not just bringing the word to you in words alone. We are bringing it through our affection. We are pouring our lives into you, into your life. So because you are dear to us. And what Paul probably doesn't say here is because you are an object of God's unconditional love as much as I am. Absolutely. Right? I've received the abundant love of God. So I will pour it out to you because I know that you are not just a number. You're not just a number. You are the object of God's unconditional love. So Paul customized his you know, language or means of communicating the gospel. Where he needed reasoning, he used reasoning. Where they needed hope, he gave hope. Where love and affection was required, he provided that. That's how he was able to communicate in a customized way, and that is the second mark of true evangelism. And the last one that I want to highlight is Paul communicated the gospel through personal example. Right? I think I've talked about it multiple times that that when we talked about true ministry and things like that, we dealt on specifically in part 4 when we studied true ministry how setting personal example is important, right? So there are several places where Paul affirms that they live exemplary lives, right? We didn't trouble you, we were not dependent on you, and we were bold in preaching and all that. It is through their personal example that they were able to provide credibility to the message. What does personal example do? It provides credibility to the message that you are preaching, right? Now, I want to clarify one thing here. When I speak about setting an example, I'm not talking about being perfect. I'm not talking about it. None of us are perfect. None of us are perfect. And none of us can be perfect unless we reach there, unless sin is gone away. Right? We are not perfect. We are imperfect people. And God will use us with our imperfect, with our warts and all that. He's not going to beautify us before He uses us. He will use it as we are, earthen vessels as we are, as George pointed out that day. We share the gospel not from our strength. I think George highlighted this in his message a couple of weeks back. We don't share the gospel from the point of view of our strengths. Right? We share the gospel drawing the strength from the one who gives us the strength. We don't preach the gospel because we are perfect. We preach the gospel because the one who gave us the gospel is perfect. And we preach we share the gospel through our imperfections so that they will not give glory to me. They will give glory, like George correctly said. If this guy can find hope, you know, it obviously is not because of him. It is because of some other, higher force, and give glory to him. Right? So we share the gospel not because we are perfect. We share the gospel not to highlight our strengths, but to amplify him through our weaknesses and imperfections. So setting an example, I don't mean being perfect. Right? Several people sometimes stay away from sharing the gospel or sharing good news because they think that, look, I am inadequate. I'm inadequate. I still live in sin. I'm a sinner. I haven't mastered everything else. So I can't do this. That's not what I mean by setting an example. What I mean is, setting an example is about giving credibility to the message through our actions. Because we cannot convey hope if we live in hopelessness. Can we? We cannot convey hope if we cannot convey love, if we feel unloved. If we feel unloved and unappreciated, we can't convey love. We can't convey the anticipation of salvation if we don't show it in our attitude, in our actions. So it's about giving credibility to our message. It is not about being perfect. So there is no one who cannot share the gospel. Every one of us can share the gospel with all our limitations, with all our mistakes, because we draw strength from the one who says, I will build my church. And you said, you did not choose me. I chose you. I chose you so that you can go and bear fruit. The one who told me, you are the light of the world, and the light is not hidden under a bushel. You are the salt of the earth. So he says, you can. And he says, you can do more than what I have done. Even all our imperfections, he can do more than all that. Trust in me, believe in me. If you have faith as small as the mustard seed, you say to this mountain, move from here, and it will move. There's nothing that is impossible for you. That's Jesus' words, not my words, not Paul's words. It is Jesus' words. Nothing is. So let us not be worried about our imperfections and our inadequacies when we think about sharing the gospel. Let's make sure that we are going ahead and do it, drawing the strength from the Lord. So that's really what I wanted to convey to you this morning, what God has conveyed to me through evangelism. What can we learn from Paul in these letters? It's not dependent on favorable conditions. Not dependent on favorable conditions. On the contrary, actually true evangelism thrives when there is opposition, when there is threat, when there is persecution. And we have a great opportunity right in our nation to do that. As the oppression increases, as the persecution increases, as the threats increase, let's pray for the evangelists who are bold to continue their work. And let us see what we can do to add to their efforts. Second, true evangelism needs special, needs, as to customize our methods, contextually relevant, culturally aligned, and demonstrated through personal example of building credibility to the message that we bring. And we can, of course, focus on reasoning, hope, love, all of them to win over our devout neighbors. Just as Paul was able to win over the devout Greeks in Thessalonica. So that's where I would like to wrap up this series. We have seen several things, and we are a small congregation. Of course, statistics, again, unofficial statistics say that the average number of church is 150. Right? So the mega churches are an exception. Tiny churches like us are also an exception, right? That's what makes the average 150. So the average itself is a small church, right? We are, of course, 15 people, but it is, sorry, we are not as 15. We are more than 15. But still, what I say is, we make the other, what we call the outlier elements which make up the average. But we are not bad, right? We are a small church, right? And we have our struggles. But the Thessalonian church tells us that we can do great things. We can be a model church. We can encourage we can build a true fellowship, a true community built on unlimited liability. I spoke about unlimited liability last time. Right? We can build a fellowship based on unlimited liability. We can go out and evangelize in our own capacities with our own limitations and all that we have. We can be transformed ourselves. The true transformation that Paul saw in Thessalonica. We can. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling blessed that I took up this study. And I am beneficiary of that, and I hope it has touched some of you too. So I will leave this with you. If at all, you want to go back and read these lessons, it's available on the net, so it's easy to access. If you would like to go back and read this thing, let us look at three things. Let us use these lessons to strengthen our faith in Jesus Christ, our faith that He is the only one. Let us use it to strengthen our hope that He will come again. And our job is to be prepared when He comes. And let us work on preparing for that through love. Faith, hope, and love. Let's strengthen that, if at all, through this series, what we have learned. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Stay blessed.